What can you say about driving games? Well, it's a genre where a lot of the games that belong to it often fall into the same trap. Just a showcase of impressive graphics for the time, but with standard paint-by-numbers gameplay. This isn't just a modern thing either. This was the case back in the 80s and 90s too. Now, we have had a ton of exceptions over the years, however, let's face it, we're all aware of the existence of the down-to-earth homogeneous titles that more so try to mimic reality. Now, trying to be realistic isn't bad by any means, but it becomes harder to stand out from the crowd. The games that do so are either so good they leave a strong impression on you, or alternatively, are so amazingly bad that it's hard to believe what you just played. This one falls under the latter example. To provide some background, Lotus is a British manufacturer of sports and racing cars. Now, this isn't the first game to be based on this line of cars. Anyone who has ever touched a Commodore Amiga will gladly tell you that there have been Lotus games before. The Lotus Turbo Challenge games are some of the most fondly remembered games on the Amiga, which is actually saying a lot seeing how there are a ton of well-remembered games on this thing. These games are my favorite sprite scaling racing games, hell, they're my favorite racing games, period. They were very well executed, very challenging, and had some of the best music you'll ever hear in a racing game. As you could probably guess, I am a huge fan of these games. So when I found out about Lotus Challenge on the GameCube, I thought it was a successor to the classic Amiga games, and thus bought it without any hesitation whatsoever before rushing home to play it out of sheer excitement. As of now, I don't know if it has any connection to the prior games. Is this game its own self-contained thing? Is it a reboot? I have no idea. However, seeing how this game was made by a British gaming studio, how well known the Lotus games were on pretty much every home computer platform, and how those home computers were mainly popular in Europe, I don't think it would be unfair to look at it as a failed reboot, as I have some doubt that the developers didn't hear of the original games. Regardless, I'm largely going to look at it as its own thing, because it's not even worth comparing it to the Amiga games. Though I will bring up a comparison here or there. You might also notice the Only 4 banner on the cover, but this isn't a GameCube exclusive. This is a game that falls under what I like to call Charlie's Angels Syndrome. In Europe, this game came out on the PlayStation 2. It did not come out on the PlayStation 2 over here, but instead on the GameCube and Xbox, so this is yet another instance of the Only 4 banner being inaccurate. So the game starts off with a static title screen with no music, which is so pathetic in comparison to the older games that's honestly quite baffling. I mean, a game console from 2001 should be able to do more than a computer from the 80s. Hell, even when pushing hardware limitations to the wayside and ignoring the Amiga original, not only did the Commodore 64 version have a more impressive intro than this, but so did the ZX Spectrum! After the game brilliantly sets the tone, we see that there are various modes to try out, starting from single races and challenges that you unlock by playing through the game's championship mode, and a campaign called Challenge Mode. Challenge Mode consists of the regular races, special events, training exercises, all while trying to follow what this game calls a story. This is also the mode that they promote the most on the box, and it's very clear that this is the main mode of the game. You also have 2 characters to play as in Challenge Mode, Jack and Zoe. Depending on which character you pick, you'll be assigned different events and special stages than the other. However, both have the same standard races and the same tutorial. Okay, I'm just going to be honest. This is by far the worst tutorial I have ever seen in my life. Not only does it fail to teach you how to play the game effectively, not only is it harder than the actual game itself, not only is it the worst part of the whole game, but it perfectly shows all of the reasons as to why this game doesn't work. First off, the controls. It's evident that this game is trying to mimic realistic car movement, but it fails horrifically at it. If the act of steering a car was this unstable and convoluted in real life, I have a nagging suspicion that driving would be illegal. Thankfully, we have a ton of control options which misleadingly have little to no noticeable impact on the controls, and then you have the aforementioned control methods, which is where things start to get really ugly. Okay, if it sounds like I'm being way too harsh on this game now, then this should put some things into perspective. It's time to talk about this game's revolutionary circular steering. To move left, you rotate the analog stick counterclockwise. To move right, you perform the inverse and rotate the analog stick clockwise. It's as awkward as it sounds. Thankfully, you have other options like standard steering, which I'll be using for the purpose of this review. However, even when using standard steering, no matter what options I select, these cars never do what they're supposed to. I'm amazed that Lotus didn't step in and cancel this game themselves, because if anything, I would see this as detrimental towards their business. I haven't driven or ridden in a Lotus car, but if this is how their cars actually handle, then I'm staying away out of fear for my own life. The game constantly pressures you to drive at high speeds, but when doing so, driving doesn't become more sensitive, leaving you to make smaller emotions to accommodate this. No, you lock in place. You keep moving forward while being unable to steer left or right or even stop. It's like you're hydroplaning on dry ground! Even when altering your speed when making a turn, it has little to no impact on the trajectory of the car. It's almost like you're on a series of fixed paths in these scenarios instead of having full control over your vehicle, in addition to all of those paths leading you directly into walls. As a result of all of this, you're either going to hug the wall around turns or crash into a wall, depending on the layout of the track. The only times I didn't have problems with the controls was when I was driving very slow. Even when driving at speeds fast enough to fancy the possibility of winning the race but slow enough not to engage in dry ground hydroplaning, the turning becomes a big problem, as upon doing so, you basically lose control over your car. The game at one point tells you to countersteer if this happens, but I have never been able to do so. You can move the analog stick as far in the opposite direction as possible, hell, even rotate it in that direction. Stop accelerating, take your hand off of the analog stick, brake, or perform any precautionary action that will counteract the prior input, but that response will mean nothing. No matter how tiny it was and how extreme your counteractions are, that initial action will keep going. Once your car decides it wants to do something to put you in danger, it will do it, and you won't be able to do anything about it. This is the point where I can't find footage of this game where the car doesn't, at one point, drive straight into a wall.
Lotus, drive our cars, listen to awesome Berry Leech Pro Tracker modules, and witness your car come to life. It will take you everywhere, from the road to off the road, off of a cliff, and ice cream shopping. But mostly off of a cliff, leaving you to experience your last moments of life prematurely, hoping desperately that some form of life exists after death. Lotus, our cars are alive, and they want to kill you.
It also doesn't help that the course track doesn't match the car's movement at all. I know that they're trying to be realistic here, but ends up feeling incredibly awkward in the same way as Shrek Extra Large, with the level design and controls working against each other instead of working in harmony. However, it's even more so here. You'll be required to make turns that could only be made if you either stop completely before proceeding slowly or by driving really slowly and diligently to begin with. The problem is, you can't do that. There's a time limit. You're going to want to keep an average speed of around 90 miles per hour with very little room of variation if you ever want to beat the tutorial. That, and in the actual races, you're going to have to drive even faster to even keep up with your opponents, which makes this problem even worse. Combine this with the strange controls and dry ground hydroplaning, and we get more crashing into walls. Even when driving slower around turns and driving fast in straight runs to compensate, I wasn't able to beat it in time. Oddly enough, with the regular track that you race after beating the tutorial, this isn't as much of an issue, which isn't saying much, but it's worth mentioning. The controls are still very, very bad, but the track design accommodates that more. Tracks like this are boring and simplistic as a result, but at the very least, it's closer to being playable than it otherwise is. Maybe this tutorial track is based directly off of a real training track for Lotus cars, but even if that's the case, that doesn't make things any better. When designing a game, you always want the layout of the level to match the movement and attributes of whatever the player is controlling. You can't just plop in any random environment assuming it will work because whatever the player is controlling can navigate through its space. When making a platformer, for instance, you have to be very careful about platform placement. The level design on a platformer is based largely on how far the character jumps, how high they jump, the minimum height clearance, how fast the character is, and plenty of other variables that accommodate the player's movement. Similar principles can, and should be, applied to any genre of games that involve direct interaction. Hell, the original sprite-scaling Lotus games understood this. When you don't do this, it never turns out well, and this is a very good example of that. After we finish the time race, we learn that the tutorial consists of miscellaneous challenges to fulfill, and we meet the announcer who will provide you with incomparable aggravation. He might just be the most annoying character that I've ever seen in a video game. If you've found yourself annoyed by the likes of Navi, Kepera Gebera, Big the Cat, Elise from Sonic 06, Silver the Hedgehog, Toad, Moneybags, or Bubsy, then you are not ready. You are not ready. He will order you to perform maneuvers without describing what the maneuvers are or even give the player the slightest idea of how to perform them. You're just expected to have the knowledge to begin with, in a tutorial level. This is how the game starts. If you fail enough times, you'll be provided with a description that is a lot less helpful than it seems. The descriptions don't really give you much of a better idea of what you're doing, as they're vague and often provide you with false information. I was stuck on some of these challenges for a longer time than I should have been. I tried endlessly to follow the descriptions, only to result in failure without any communication of what I was doing wrong. When I did succeed, I didn't even know what I did right. So when playing the game as the other character, I was stuck all over again. The epitome of this was the Power Slide Challenge, where you're required to perform the aforementioned maneuver in order to progress. How do you perform a power slide in this game? Who the fuck cares? This game just drops you in and expects you to have the prerequisite knowledge to begin with in a tutorial level. It's basically like having a bad professor in a community college.
Good day, class. I am Professor Sadist, and welcome to Introduction to Programming 1. Tell me, do you know how to program at the proficiency of an IBM coder?
No, I came in this class to learn.
Congratulations. You're going to fail, because I will actively refuse to teach you, but instead expect you to do stuff on your own, even though I have not given you sufficient materials to actually do so.
What kind of class is this?
Oh, that reminds me. Don't ask me questions. That'll get me annoyed, because questions are for the weak.
What?
You are either a coder from birth, or an incompetent sloth. We are the strong. We are the determined. We are the elite. We welcome no one else into our Know How to Program club. We...
Sounds more to me like you have some major insecurity issues.
I do!
So, in order to do a power slide, you have to gain a speed of around 90 miles per hour, and then use the handbrake as you turn. However, if you apply too much handbrake, your car spins out of control. You want to know how much application of the handbrake is too much? Lightly tapping the B button! This is also when the announcer character is at his most punchable.
Oh, what are you doing? You're driving like your grandmother!
Zoe, your dog can do this blindfolded.
Oh, what are you doing?
Zoe, your dog can do this blindfolded.
He just constantly scolds you, saying that your dog could do better or that your grandmother can do better, when, with controls as bad as these, anyone actually succeeding is vastly unrealistic. Completing a tutorial segment shouldn't be harder to pull off than a run-through of Journey to Silius. Hell, even in that scenario, the challenge should come from the right source and not amazingly terrible controls and terrible communication. So, with the absolutely wretched tutorial out of the way, we dive straight into the regular racing. For the most part, it's fairly standard stuff. You race a series of opponents around a few laps and we try to work your way into the first place. However, even this is not without some issue. The other cars are all bunched together, often in the same lane, and as a result, getting into first place has very little reward. In the original Lotus Turbo Challenge, the cars were all spread out, and working your way up to first place was far from instantaneous. It was a very gradual effort, and it was very important not to hit anything, as it would slow you down a lot, leaving the player motivated to maneuver around the track and other racers as perfectly as humanly possible. As a result, winning wasn't just something that happened, it was an accomplishment. Granted, this is fairly standard stuff, but what sets it apart from other racing games of the time was just how amazingly executed it is. Hell, it still holds up really well. Even after the novelty of the graphics wore off, people still go back to these games and play them to this very day. Nobody talks about this one because even when putting aside the bad controls, it hasn't aged well in the slightest. It wasn't even good by 2001 standards. Here, you're either in first or dead last. As the challenge doesn't come from working your way up from the bottom to top, it's fighting these controls and trying not to crash into walls. However, if you don't like the standard races, don't worry, this game has a lot more up its sleeve. There are various other challenges, often focusing on objectives specific to that course, such as get the package to the airstrip in time, racing badly textured people while you're on vacation, and I swear to God, I'm not making this up, car soccer.
Car football. Can you believe that?
These controls made it hard enough to drive, and now you expect me to play soccer with them? What's next?
Car bowling.
However, otherwise, this game got old fast, with the frustrating controls providing more problems as the racetracks became more elaborate. Now, I try to play each game that I review all the way through at least once, if not multiple times. However, I just can't bring myself to continue playing this. Even if they threw in card gymnastics or fucking card tea ceremony, this game left me so dry that I have little to no motivation to play it ever again. Very few games have brought me to that point, and this is the first game that I reviewed to ever do so. However, for what it's worth, the music is pretty good. It's not on par with the music from the prior Lotus games by any stretch of the imagination, but it's by far the best part about this game. The songs are a mix of orchestral and electronic, and while not very hummable, it's pleasing to the ears. The soundtrack was done by a band called Hybrid, and most, if not all, of the songs were already on prior albums of theirs, so even the best part of this game wasn't done with it in mind and could be experienced elsewhere. Though, I should be a little sympathetic. This was done by a studio called Kuju, and this was their second game. Since then, they've moved on and made some titles that you might recognize, like Art Academy and its Pokemon variant. Hell, I play around with the Wii U version of A Fair Deal. However, just looking at this game itself, it's really, really bad. If it wasn't for the terrible controls, it would just be a mediocre racer, with bizarre challenges and good music. However, the controls destroy any potential fun this game could have possibly brought, unless you are far more forgiving than I am. I often tell people that I'd rather play a game with not so good controls instead of a game with flawed design, as a good designer can know how to work with and downplay the weaknesses of the controls. However, not only does the track layout fail to do that, I don't think it could have succeeded. This is without question one of the worst games I've ever reviewed, and unless you are a complete sadomasochist, I would not recommend this at all.